The concept of decolonisation has gained renewed momentum in recent years. While the term itself remains the subject of heated debate, the decolonial movement continues to have a profound impact globally on a variety of cultural institutions. For cultural critic Walter Mignolo, decolonisation entailed not just the dismantling of social and geopolitical structures, but also of Eurocentric ways of thinking and seeing. These ways of understanding the world remain deeply embedded in Western cultures, in their colonial histories and in the spaces and institutions that define how the world is viewed. Museums are places where we struggle over the past and its meanings. These struggles remain inextricably linked to the structures of power and cultural formations of the present.
Think about what an American narrative is and what American narrative can be. There have been, I think, certain gatekeepers around that narrative over time. And we think of an American history or the American history. I think that what this show is proposing and what hip hop proposes is an American history. And that we're coming into a period of time where we're talking about American histories, plural. And I think that that plurality of histories is something that you see walking around this institution, walking through many of these galleries. When you look at, no one of our galleries can really be bounded by geography, because global trade, both enforced and free, has been moving throughout all of the objects that we have in this institution.
Curating is a word that we're all using a lot these days, right? I mean, people talk about curating a playlist or curating a menu, and I think that really the historical root of the word has to do more with caring for something. So it's not just the selecting, as we might think of it, but it's also the ongoing care for works.
Curation and being a curator basically involves two things. Number one, you're taking care of objects, you're a steward of objects, you're ensuring the safety of the object, you're ensuring that the object isn't decaying or falling into disrepair.
We have some sculptural works on view, and we have to be really mindful that we install them in a way that hopefully they won't get touched by our visitors or viewers. That's why you'll often see works under a vitrine, under a glass case. Other times we have works on paper. So in this presentation, we have 2 works by the photographer James Vanderzee, and those are light sensitive. So works on paper can typically only be up for like 6 months. And then we have to take them off view and we'll put up something else in its place.
You're also studying the object. You're talking about the origins of the object. Who made it? How did they make it? Why did they make it? You're recording all of that information. You're talking to the folks who bought the object or who brought it to the museum to keep that record of how it's been passed through generations. And then you're also writing about the object, studying the object, and then placing it on the walls of the museum to make sure that the visitors can understand and appreciate the history of the object.
I'll answer this in 2 ways, because I think that there's a distinction that's important to be made between curatorial work and curatorial practice and exhibition making. So what I think that I've done through many, many different phases of my career is exhibition making work. So work that's really about selecting artwork, selecting artists, determining a theme for an exhibition, determining its layout, thinking about how visitors will interact with it. That's exhibition making. It's one very, very important part of what curators do, but it's not all of what curators do. It's just what the public sees. But a lot of what curators do is really about taking care of the art and being stewards of the art, bringing artwork into the collection of an institution, deaccessioning artwork from a collection of an institution. That is not the work that I do. I am very much an exhibition maker, so that is what curators do in collecting institutions. And the extent to which it is an art form, I think that what good curatorial work does is it helps to produce knowledge. It creates new ways of knowing and new ways of seeing through different kinds of juxtapositions of objects that you might never think of being together. A good example in this exhibition is that we have a lot of painting and photography right next to things that you might be more familiar with in a cultural museum or a history museum, like fashion and photography, documentary photography. And so when you get these interesting juxtapositions, you get different conversations about how we understand a kind of a knowledge base to be. And so that's really the creative work, I think, of doing curatorial work.
When we think about conventional exhibitions, you might often think about like a solo exhibition that's focused on an artist's work. So maybe it's a new young artist, maybe it's a career retrospective for an older artist, or a historical artist, right? Additionally, you might see a thematic exhibition. So it's a presentation on a particular subject, and it's often bounded by a time period, like, 19th century something something, or a geographical region. So you might see a show on American landscape painting of the 19th century or something like that. When we think about more innovative approaches, we might think about introducing, maybe it's a new subject. So again, it could be a young artist whose work you haven't heard of yet, or it could be a new interpretation of an artist whose name is well known. It could also be a brand new subject. So our upcoming hip hop show is a perfect example of that. So this collection installation is organized thematically. So, as you think about narratives, we have a group of works that have to do with the metropolis. We're thinking about the city because this is a presentation that's focused on American works from between 1900 and 1950. And if you think sort of historically and culturally about that time, right, there's so much urbanization that's happening. There's the Great Migration that's happening from the south to the north. There is war and displacement of people. There's a rise in labor and manufacturing. So what we've done in this room is we've grouped together certain objects to try to tell those stories, so that if you're seeing a group of works that's organized around a theme like the city, you should be able to look at them and think about, what does it mean to be living in a city? Hip hop comes out of an urban culture, and the intensity of urban life. I think also hip hop is an innovation, right? It's experimental, it's innovative, and we have a section as well in this installation that really is about artists experimenting, and that can be done either through new materials and how they're working with new materials for the first time. It can also be, again, how they're reinterpreting subjects, which again is standard practice, I think, in a lot of hip hop culture as it's evolved over the 50 years, right? You take something old and you make something brand new with it. And we see artists in here who are doing exactly the same thing.
What I saw when I was a curator at the National Portrait Gallery was that contemporary art and hip hop were constantly intertwined. There were moments where contemporary artists were referencing hip hop songs. There were moments when hip hop artists were being portrayed in artworks. And it suddenly hit me that this relationship between hip hop and contemporary art was more than just graffiti, and that it needed a longer look and a more expansive look. And as I started to work through the idea and started talking to my colleagues and started reading about what other folks had done on hip hop shows, it became apparent that there was two different approaches to hip hop in the museum world. One was to look at it just from like the history point of view. Start with Kool Herc and his sister Cindy in the 1970s Bronx Block Party, and move through kind of like the record of that movement in terms of photographs, and less from an artistic point of view, but more from a material culture or historical point of view. So that was one approach that museums were taking. Another approach was to talk about contemporary art and hip hop, but mostly through the idea of graffiti. Because that's how most people, when you say hip hop and contemporary art, that's what most people think of. And so for all of us, as we began to think about this idea, we saw that we needed to build in all of the other kinds of ways of making and celebrating hip hop that were occurring with the young creatives and even the older artists. And so what we realized was that this wasn't just going to be a show about graffiti. It was not just going to be a show about the history. It was going to be a show about the history, graffiti. It was going to be a show about the wigs. It was going to be a show about the fashion. It was going to be a show about the music. It was going to be a show about the shoes. But it was also going to be a show about the beautiful, beautiful sculptures and paintings and installations that so many people look at on a daily basis and maybe recognize has some kind of hip hop in it, but don't really understand.